Hello, my friend, wherever you find yourself in space and time. Free open source software serves as the backbone for much of the web. Yet somehow, even though the software is free, we keep hearing stories of open source companies raising millions of dollars in funding. The open source ecosystem is flush with cash, and some contributors and some companies have figured out how to make money off what is, by definition, free. To help me make sense of the economics of open source, I'm joined by longtime open source contributor and podcaster, Christie Chirinos. Christie, welcome to my little chat here on the internet.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here and talk about this. It is probably one of the things that I have become most passionate about. A little bit about me. I have been involved as an open source contributor to WordPress for about 6 years. WordPress. What's the background here, Morten? Do I need to explain what WordPress is?
No.
No. Okay. And I've been involved with WordPress in a handful of different capacities, but mostly with commercialization and product growth across WordPress plugins, as well as web hosting and other companies. And so I'm really excited to be here. I also took a sabbatical this summer and created a passion project that I think is going to be what we're going to mostly talk about here, which is the Open Source Economist podcast. And I am pumped to talk about it some more.
Yeah, this is the reason why I called you for this chat, because I've been in the open source world like you for many, many years. And it's the question that I keep seeing raised, both within the open source community and also especially from outside, right? This notion that for a large percentage of the open source world, the software is effectively free. Either it's licensed as a free open source project, or it's effectively free in that it once you get a hold of it, you can redistribute it and do whatever you want with it. Mm-hmm. Yet some people make money, and everyone is always asking, like, how is it possible to make money when it's free? And what is the mechanism you use to make money? Like, how do you, as an individual contributor, how do you get paid to do open source? And just as importantly, as a company, how do you build a solid economic foundation for your company on open source software?
Yeah, there's a handful of things that I think are really important to mention when you get in that conversation. One, it is so complicated. It is not abnormal for incredibly brilliant, educated, accomplished people to look at commercial open source software and just be like, what? And I have had conversations with extremely accomplished lawyers, and I would explain my my business that was also my entrance into WordPress, which was Caldera Forms, a form building plugin that is open source and available for WordPress. And I would explain it, and they would say, "So you sell free software?"
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say, yes, we've built an entire business based on selling things that are free. And bless you. And that always struck me because it reminds me to keep perspective. When you're embedded in an open source community, it's so easy to forget that outside of the open source communities, none of this makes any sense. It subverts so much of what we understand business and the world to be, which is I exchange money for a good or service. It cracks me up. And
yeah, I think that's sort of one of the key components here, that open source as an ideology,
right,
runs counter, or at least appears to run counter to the ideology that our entire world is based on, which is this somewhat free market capitalism, where you want something from me, you give me money or some sort of goods in exchange, Whereas in open source, you're more in like a socialist realm where people are just contributing their work freely, and then anyone who needs it just takes it and does whatever they want with it, and then maybe contributes back or maybe not.
Right.
So give me an example. So if I am a company and I want to create a company, and I'm involved with an open source community, and I say I want to actually build a company and make money and have a staff and pay them, what is a model I can set up that allows me to do that?
Yeah, so there are multiple models and we'll discuss them. The most straightforward model is commercial open source. So what does that mean? You're creating open source software. That's the free software that you're going to start selling. And people are going to use it for whatever purpose it serves. We have open source software that, again, use it to build forms, or GIMP is a open source software project that a lot of people are familiar with. And you have a method by which you can pay for the software. You will pay for a download of that package, which is free. So the question that begs is, well, okay, hold on. If I give money to someone and then I get a zip file, essentially, and can't I just email that to someone else? Yes, you absolutely can. And people do. And that happens all the time. The difference there is you can't contact the commercial entity. So what the commercial entity is selling you isn't really the software, it's what the software accomplishes. So usually that means you can get support. You'll be able to message the commercial entity behind the open source software and say, hey, how do I do this? Or I'm trying to figure this out, or so on and so forth. And then we'll have commercial open source software that does integrate licensing and updates into the software. So you can get it, you can get those files, but if you want the newest version, you either have to go through that process again of finding somebody who will send you that zip file of the new stuff, or you will be incorporated into the commercial licensing aspect of it. Now, that's not the only way, but that tends to be the most straightforward, direct way for commercial open source to begin being a business.
Right.
It's important to note that right below the layer of an open source project beginning to commercialize is this idea that you have an open source project with contributors and maintainers that accept donations. And to me, that is not a business, that is a charity. So we're skipping past that.
Yeah. And I think in this, you're highlighting an important point, that the open source does not necessarily mean you're not going to pay money.
Right.
Even with free open source software, it's not implied that you're not going to spend money or pay money, because that's often this weird assumption that because something is free, it doesn't cost money.
Right.
Well, in reality, it's like, I think a good example of this is I lived in a building a while ago where we needed a new security camera system. And a company came to us and said, we can give you a security camera system that is open source. And the selling point was, if you buy a commercial system from some company that's licensed, then you're paying like $10,000 a year for the privilege of continuing to use your existing equipment that you already paid for. And if you stop paying the $10,000 license, then you basically have cameras that are not working, right? They just turn it off. And the open source system was, we will install the system and then you can pay us to maintain it, or you can find someone else who also maintains the same system. But even though it's like the software is free, the hardware configurations are free, you're still buying all the pieces, and no one in the building knew how to maintain or use it. So you still have to pay someone to maintain or use it. You're just taking away that hostage situation of a commercial license that says, like, if you don't do this, if you don't give us money continuously, we will like turn your system off. So that's a piece of it that I find often gets confused.
Yeah. To me, the idea of having that, for a lack of a better word, I want to call it a kill switch, but that's not really true. It's just the ability of turning it off or making it not work. I think that's actually quite a controversial concept, right? It
Mhm.
goes against the open source ethos, so to say. And a lot of open source projects don't have that. And some people might say, oh, yeah, that's really great. But there's a dark, dark side to that, which is what happens when open source software is used for nefarious purposes. You can't turn it off. It's
Yes.
just out there being distributed into the world. The most you can do if you're a commercial open source company using that one business model, you can say, well, we're canceling your commercial account. So, you can't open support tickets. You can't come to us. You can't get, I don't know, this premium content or whatever, all the other stuff that may be associated with a piece of open source software, but the software can continue to be used.
Mhm.
And one way to prevent that could be what they were doing with your camera system, which is absolutely wild to me, actually. That sounds outrageous, but woof. And
Well, no, sorry, I need to
yeah,
be
no,
clear
no, go
that
ahead.
the company wasn't saying that they were gonna turn it off. It was the commercial companies that were competing.
Right.
Uh, so the open source company was like, if you get our system, you what the hell? There we go. If you buy a commercial system, you're held hostage by the commercial company, not the open source system. The open source system was like, you don't have to do this. You can buy the system and
Oh,
everything, and then
okay.
we will maintain it. And if you don't like us, just go somewhere else, and they'll maintain it. And if
Right.
and until you need help, you don't need to pay anyone, right?
Okay. Yeah. So I
So
I'd
I wasn't
misunderstood
clear
that.
about that, but that was like, but the crazy part about that story is in that situation. So you have, a famous security company who comes in and says, you have to pay us $10,000 a year for the privilege of using our system. And if you stop paying, we turn it off. And then in addition, you have to pay a service cost every time we come out, right?
Mhm.
Or you have this open source company who says it's the exact same system. The only difference is the software underpinning it isn't under a license that
Right.
costs money. So you pay us to install it, which is not $10,000. And then if you need help, you pay us to come out and do it, right?
Right.
And then the people who made decisions were like, we don't feel comfortable with that. We're going to pay the $10,000 a year because it doesn't seem right. It
Yeah.
seems somehow insecure or shaky, or like it's this. People have a very hard time just wrapping their heads around the idea that someone would willingly allow a competitor to take their contract from them. And it
Right.
seems almost fishy, right? It's like, why would you do this? What's wrong with this? It doesn't seem right. And then they're like, no, we'll rather pay $10,000 to feel safe, which is,
And that's what you're paying for, right? There's so many components to that. The first one is I was talking to one of my clients yesterday, and we were just saying, oh, well, when it comes to WordPress, it's kind of like renegades and anarchy, right? You're over here because you want to just do it yourself, maintain it, move on. And so you see a lot of that
Mhm,
with open source software, commercial or donation based. And then the other part is, yeah, that breaks down into when it comes to any sort of commercial relationship, you have to ask who's paying for what. It tends
mhm,
to be unclear in today's day and age, right? I think that there was a time in the past in which that was a lot more clear. And in that camera example, that's right, you're paying for the peace of mind. And isn't that so true with security systems, right? You're paying for the peace of mind. You're paying for not thinking about that right now. You're not really paying for that cameras. I mean, you are, right? But then open source software being involved in that demonstrates that sometimes you're paying for something slightly different. That it's sort of my second involvement with a major open source project was actually with WooCommerce. And
mhm,
so I dove into the deep end of sort of the right now largest market share e-commerce open source project. And the comparison always is what? Shopify, right?
mhm,
And so Shopify is this proprietary system and it's used for e-commerce, and the benefit is exactly that. It's Shopify is a peace of mind. I go in it and it is just set. and I know where everything is. The Shopify App Store controls everything, and it's easy, and I can get it set up, and I don't have to think about it too much, right? So that actually brings up something that I think is really interesting, which is how do commercial open source companies compete, right? Competition is an important analysis of any business model. So the way they compete is one, price, right? You just
Mhm.
said it. You can pay this company, or you can be a renegade anarchist and take care of it yourself. And flexibility, right? Because if you do understand the open source project and you are able to contribute and have those skills, then you can kind of make it sing whatever song you want. And
Mhm.
so those tend to be the competitive angles of a commercial open source company, that first sort of straightforward business model for open source projects. But then your direct competition may be other commercial open source company, and your indirect competition is going to be those proprietary software companies that are saying, well, we can do that thing, but just give it to us.
Yeah. So that brings up an important question. Like, so you just described basically making a company that sells a product, right? And it's under an open source license instead of under a commercial license.
Mhm.
So that's one model, but there are several other models you can pursue too,
Right.
including like, things that you've been working on yourself, right?
Right. And I mean, I would say that your building camera example is a slightly different business model, because I would imagine that this open source project for the camera that you can maintain yourself, that's the commercial open source entity.
Mhm.
And they are most likely being paid in some way by the other camera people that will take care of the system yourself if you don't want to. So the
Right.
the other camera people are the implementation business model,
Mhm.
which is exactly what it sounds like, right? We know a whole lot about this open source project, and we might even have a special relationship with them, and we will implement this for you, right? That tends to be like, those are your freelancers, that's your agencies, and that's common all across the board. People make money with open source by using it and implementing it for other people. That's true for proprietary software too. That is
Mhm.
just the software business model. We will take this thing and make it work for you. So that is all over the place with open source. There's nothing outrageous about that. And the implementation model, what it asks is that question: what are you paying for?
Yeah.
Right? It's a lot more clear with commercial open source software business models. Implementation models a little bit different. And when it comes to WordPress, for example, I've always thought it's really interesting that when it comes to an implementation model, people tend to think, oh, you're going to hire a WordPress developer. That's not always true. Sometimes you're hiring a WordPress developer, but sometimes you're hiring what we, in some of my past work, have called implementors,
Yeah.
right? So what does that mean? People who are really, really, really good at installing WordPress and installing associated plugins and themes and making it sing without necessarily writing a ton of code.
Mhm.
So the implementation business model isn't always digging into the open source code, right?
Yeah.
Digging into the open source project. It's quite literally that. It's implementation. And I think there's a lot of money that sits in there. I don't know. Is that true? Is that true, Morten? I
Yeah.
feel like you've
Uh,
been in open source longer than I have.
the vast majority of people I know that make money in open source are implementers in some
Right.
fashion. And it's interesting that you're making the distinction between implementers and developers, because I do that too. And it's, as you know, it's a little bit controversial sometimes because developers specifically do not like to be bundled in with implementers. But to me,
Yeah.
it's more of the line goes in, are you working in the interface and like configuring things, or are you working in the code
Yeah.
writing things? That is to me the difference, because and this is the controversial part, what I've
That's right.
encountered many times is developers who are not very good implementers. So their
Mhm.
solution to any problem is to write the code
Yes.
instead of going, someone else already wrote the code better than I can ever do. And
Mhm.
you click this button, add this thing, and then you spend 2 hours configuring it instead of spending 2 weeks writing a whole new thing.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's, to my experience, there's a lot of money in just helping people set up and configure these things. Like WooCommerce is a great example.
Right.
If someone is going to build, like if someone comes to me and says, "Hey, I want to build an online store," I always say, "Go to Shopify."
Right?
And
You
the
know
reason
what's
for that is
I do
not
that
that it's
too.
simple; it's because I don't want them to get dinged by the IRS 5 years from now for having fucked up their, sorry, for having messed up their
Their
tax
taxes.
setup,
Their
because it's
taxes,
so damn
yes.
complicated, right? Was it someone told me that within New York State alone, there's like 97 different tax codes, and it depends on where you are and where you're selling to, and it's like all, and that stuff needs to be set up correctly. And if you offload services to Shopify or BigCommerce or any of these commercial entities, they take on the responsibility of making sure that's correct. Whereas if you do it with WooCommerce, you're doing it yourself. And that's when the implementer comes in and you bring in someone who's like, I know how to do this correctly, sign this contract, and I take the liability of setting this up right. Hopefully, if they do it in an ethical business way.
Right, right. It's embarrassing admission that totally happened to me at the beginning of my career. I DIY'd my WordPress store, and then the state of New York, because I lived in New York City, the state of New York was like, "This is wrong," you know. I had to call the state of New York and been like, "I'm a small business. I don't know how to do this," and then I had to like negotiate the fee down and I'll apply for some other thing, and I was just like, "Never again," you know. But yeah, the controversy has always been interesting to me because, in my opinion, and this is, total hot take, it stems from the lack of understanding that there's a difference between a business model and a value and a set of operations, right? Like, those are all different things. The business model for your developers and implementers is the exact same, right? It's a
Mhm.
services contract. And so the developers and implementers get into this muck of, well, do this and who's what, and don't and you're not really a developer and blah blah blah, right? And to me, it's just so ridiculous because and I talk about this a lot in the podcast throughout the episodes, is my interest has generally been to explain, because that's how you push forward growth, is you understand the problem and create a framework that makes sense for what action you're taking, right? And
Mhm.
so my passion is explaining. That's why I was so passionate about creating that podcast and creating those definitions and creating that language, and those pictures and charts about what is going on. And what I have said, I say it multiple times on the podcast, I'm like, I actually have no skin in this game. I don't care. I actually do not care whether the developers and the implementers and the controversy and the this and this and that. Oh yes, that's it. And to me, it is just something that can go either way, and the voices and whatnot can bicker for whatever it is. But to me, I am looking at how do we apply the things that we already know about the world to explain this renegade total anarchy that even the most brilliant people in the world right now are working to get their heads around, right? And
Mhm.
that's one of them. And that business model can be everything. I mean, I in the same business model of services is just using the software to produce a final product. Again, going on the example of GIMP, you can hire people that will make you graphic assets on GIMP. That is an implementer business model.
Mhm.
And it really just comes down to how you're getting paid. Now, what you're doing, the services you're providing, to the extent to which you're providing them, as you know, are just absolutely massive in range with open source. Why? Because there's not a lot of oversight, and that's something that I've started to look at. Well, I know this is your work, but there's not a lot of oversight even from a business perspective, right? I am by no means a free market capitalism type person. I also take a balanced and definition based approach to that whole controversy. But the facts are that even in more established industries, we see self regulating industries. Even the ones that maybe should be more regulated for hiring, that's a different conversation. But we see self-regulated industries, and then we see governmentally regulated industries. And when it comes to the services model, we don't really have a whole lot of that. And so standards can vary, and that's where we get into all the bickering and the controversy.
Yeah, as a WordPress professional for many years, I cannot count the number of times I came across clients or people who came to me who had spent some amount of money, and it varied all over the place, on some atrocious garbage that was completely and they would often come to me in desperation saying they'd spent their budget on this disaster that went nowhere, and then now the developer or implementer is MIA and they're screwed. Can you help? And I'm like, well, do you have money? I mean, but it's true that there's I think that contributes to the Wild West component,
Right.
of that you're throwing yourself into an environment where there is no clear, like there's no Better Business Bureau for open source.
Right.
And due to that fact, even though, like, you can always say there's always just a few rotten apples that ruins the whole barrel, right? But the key to that is that it ruins the whole barrel, that once it starts being rotten, it's impossible for people outside to tell whether or not the person they're talking to is legit when everyone else isn't. And then you have this ecosystem problem in addition, that you have an ecosystem of a community with a lot of popularity contests internally, and a lot of, like, some people bubble to the top and become the people that take on all the business, and then the other ones don't, and everyone's competing against that one business to just get some foothold. And that is, insider baseball for the people who are in the community, and for everyone outside, it's just chaos, because they're like, how am I supposed to know? And an example of that is things like, someone shows me their website and they have 3 SEO plugins installed.
Yeah.
Because they've been told by different people that they need to have this one plugin, or they've even had implementers who've installed a plugin and then deactivated it, but then they've gone in and been like, but this other person said, so they've turned them all on. And because it's not clear what you should be doing. So you're like, I'll just turn them all on. And then,
right.
And then your source code becomes very interesting.
Right. And from a commercialization standpoint, what's the consequence of that? Slower page loads, less traffic. There's a direct hit to the bottom line based on this sort of Wild West. I like that. And ultimately, though, we're probably going to watch that change. Why? Because there's not really any way that it can't, because again, it's a direct hit to the bottom line. And like you said at the beginning of this conversation, we are entering a world in which people are paying attention, in which open source companies are raising millions of dollars, in which giant open source companies are being bought by giant technology giants, right? That Red Hat acquisition blew everybody's mind a few years ago. And that was years now, right? This isn't happening in the last 6 months. This is now sort of like a 10-year march, as you know. And when we start to see that, the inevitable effect is going to be those giants are pushing forth things that should be. And the question, and I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it is all about that hit to the bottom line, right? That's what it comes down.
You need to explain this. What you just said. You need to explain that, because you said, I don't think it's a conspiracy. And anyone who's not an open source, when you say that, will be like, what? How is this a
You're
conspiracy?
right. You're right. Yeah, you're
What is
totally
the
right.
conspiracy here?
What is the
Because
conspiracy, right?
that is like an open source insider conspiracy thing. So can you explain
Right.
that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. So what do I mean by that's not a conspiracy? In the business world, we all understand that eventually businesses need to regulate. Point blank. I don't know if open source, maybe because of its nature, right? Because of what it
Mm,
is, it's sort of this renegade thing. Maybe because it has provided so much for so long for so many people in this free way. And again, its differentiators are, the flexibility and the cost. There's a lot of resistance to this idea that a large company may buy Red Hat and then start to think, well, we may benefit and our clients may benefit and the world overall may benefit if we propose a set of standards for what this should look like, right? When you think about, I'm trying to think of a industry that would be potentially less resistant to something like this. Construction.
yeah.
I don't
Like,
think you get a whole lot of construction people that are like, let us do what we want. We should have whatever authority over we need. The construction industry should be free. Like, I'm pretty sure all construction people are like, yeah, if you don't regulate, like things fall and people die and like that would
yeah.
be bad, right? And the open source worlds, because of their nature, tend to resist that kind of movement. And again, this is something that to me, I don't really have any skin in this game. I don't care to do anything but to explain, understand, and apply. Um, and try to do the right thing while at it. But at the same time, like if you ask me, should the big companies be doing this? I'm like, honestly, I do not know. That's what I mean by I don't
Yeah.
have any skin in the game. Not that I don't care, just that I do not know. And so you get the existing open source contributors, and this is also a dynamic of it, right? Like I don't know that there are like little communities of construction people that have been working on a specific construction thing and all know each other intimately and have been volunteering their time. So you get this dynamic that feels a lot of sense of ownership, feels a
Mhm.
lot of sense of don't tell me what to do. I've been doing this for a long time. I've put in so much of my heart and soul into this that then you get, oh, someone out there is trying to push us out. I think it's a very human instinct of thinking that something is a huge program when the vast majority of inefficient regulation is just sheer incompetence.
Mhm.
And when it comes to open source, we have to think about, like you said, those 3 SEO plugins, but it's going to be really hard to figure out how to solve that problem in a way that helps the site owner without getting a whole bunch of stuff pretty wrong
Yeah.
and then having to go back and being like, well, that was a terrible standard, right? We're going to have to fix that. And that's already happening, right? Because we have the accessibility standards. We already have certain sets of standards for the web. We're just going to have to get a lot more standards about what services should be and how they should be sold and whatever. And so we're gonna have to go back and be like, well, that was a mistake, right? Or that wasn't really the right thing to do. The world will evolve. But the resistance there is what I meant by it's not a
Yeah.
conspiracy.
I
Yeah.
think that's interesting too, because it highlights this tension that I observe all the time, which is in open source communities, when the open source communities are successful, you get these large commercial entities that exist, right? So in the WordPress community, you have things like Automatic, you have
Mhm.
10up, which is an agency, you have
Yeah.
Human Made, you have Yoast, who is like this monster machine that
Mhm.
has now been acquired by an even bigger machine. And
Mhm.
these commercial entities inject their developers into the project and steer the project in specific directions, right? And
Right.
this is accepted by the community because the entities are grown out of the community. Right?
Mhm.
And in the case of Automatic, the company is owned by one of the 2 co-founders of the WordPress project itself.
Mhm.
But then when an outside company comes in and says, hey, we also have a vested interest in this, say like a small company like Google comes into WordPress and says, hey, so we have a vested interest in the internet and how the
Right.
web functions, and you are running like 40% of the web, so we want to help your project do this correctly. And then they start injecting money in and sending in developers. And then some people start going, oh, this is how a conspiracy theory begins, right? People go, oh, what are they doing here, right? But then at the same time, I find that like, there's this notion that if money is being generated by people in the bubble, it's
Mhm.
fine. And if they somehow obtain more power in the project because of the money they're generating, that's not a problem. But if someone comes from the outside and does the exact same thing, that's not okay. And that's
Mhm.
somehow evil and harmful to the open source project. And you see it in many different cases, like when the GitHub Copilot project. I don't know if you heard about this. So GitHub has made this
Yeah.
AI thing that sits in VS Code that helps you write code. And what they
Right.
did was they just went and scrubbed all open code on GitHub, and then they had a machine learning algorithm try to figure that out, right?
Mhm.
And then people immediately reacted and said, "Oh, they're stealing our proprietary code."
Right,
Blah,
they're
blah, blah,
taking
blah,
our
blah, blah, blah.
jobs. It basically is what it is.
And then
Right.
and then one of the main arguments was, you can't take my code that I published on GitHub under an open source license and turn it into a commercial product. And then I went and I said, that's what open source companies do constantly. Like, you can't make that argument as long as the open source economy is based on that exact same premise. And the amount of backlash I got for saying that out loud was shocking. Like, people are going, oh, well, but it's somehow different, right? And the only difference, to my understanding, is that this is Microsoft, right? And
Right.
caveat, I work for LinkedIn. LinkedIn is owned by Microsoft, blah blah blah. I don't speak for my employer, etc., etc. I'm not trying to defend it. I'm just saying that from an open source perspective, if you actually look at just what is happening here, I don't see the difference. And then it got even more bizarre when a bunch of open source developers were like, we're going to make the same tool, but we're going to make it open source and do the exact same thing. Like, where's the API for GitHub so we can just scrub all the data and just basically make the same tool, but now it's open source, and that makes it okay. So there's this ingrained ideological framework that is being used when talking about open source that contains within it this extreme tension between this should be something that people just do out of the goodness of their heart and their interest in the thing. And at the same time, this is something some people should be allowed to make money off, but under very limited circumstances, based on some sort of virtuous contribution to the project, right? So
It's the utopia mindset. That's how I see that, right? Because like the world that you just described, like sounds pretty nice actually. Like we all contribute into this thing and we all got to eat and stuff. So like we do just enough and we make sure that everybody has enough within our community. Like that's like really sweet. In a bubble, I love that. That's really tender. And when I say I guess like I don't have a skin in the game, what I really mean is like I'm scared of that backlash that you were talking about, so I just stick to explaining. So that world sounds really tender in theory. I think like I love everything about that. But like you said, what is happening here from a larger perspective is it's becoming apparent that there's money to be made, so bigger players that want to make money are looking. I mean, that's just like point blank. Like that is how this works right now, and it doesn't feel that controversial or shocking for this to be happening. And the way that it has to be addressed is it has to be done correctly. And there's this sense of, like you said, they're coming in and how dare they, right? But the reality is that mismanagement of the open source communities, of those groups of people, will have the worst impact on that corporate bottom line. That's the worst case scenario, right? You and I hear so much about automatic, and again, I want to live in that beautiful tender world, but I don't, and so I'm trying to navigate that, and we all are. And so you brought up automatic. Automatic, I think, receives a lot of praise and a lot of criticism because there's such a presence in WordPress, but the business facts of it, it's that the worst possible case scenario for automatic is to lose the millions of dollars that come that are saved by the open source contributors to WordPress.
Yeah.
That is the worst possible case scenario, because that is where the proposition of open source is coming in. It's if you have this whole community, if you have this this communal resource, then we're not reinventing the wheel every single time. Different people can use it for different things. And so the worst thing that can happen for any of these automatic S companies is some mess happens within the open source community that maintains whatever project they're dependent on, and then you have to foot those costs yourself. Like, you're screwed, right?
Yeah.
It's not
They have a
probably
vested
not
interest
viable
in the
business model.
success.
Right.
If the project fails, that company has no foot to stand on, right?
Right.
And I think that's what's difficult for people to reconcile, is that these companies have influence in open source projects because they invest in the open source project, because their existence is predicated on the success of the open source project.
Right.
But in having that influence, like having that investment in the project, they also want to steer the project towards avenues that give them more money, right? Because that's all that's driven. And within that comes up this issue of equity, right? That like you alluded to, that open source is by and large based on volunteer contributors just writing code or doing work, like building community, whatever, within the community, without getting any kind of money or anything in return other than good karma and feeling great about what they're doing and being able to use the software and influence the project, right? And then as things get more commercialized, some people start being paid, right? And they're not, there's always this argument about like, well, no one is actually being paid to write open source software, but they're being paid by a company to, and the company like volunteers their time to write.
Every time I hear that, I'm just like, the open source economist in me is like, you know what I mean? Like, that's, I don't know.
Nonsense. It's a nonsense argument. It's like someone saying to me, like, you get LinkedIn volunteers your time to make courses for LinkedIn that then they sell them. It's like that. So they're paying me to make courses. Yes, it's the same, right? It's like you're being paid to write open source software. You're not being paid to volunteer your time to write open source software.
I stay out of the hot takes, but this is a hot take that I have. I'll pick on the little hot takes. Those are the hills I'll die on, is the tiny ones. This is one of the ones I'll die on. It's just the dumbest thing. Every time I hear that, every time I'm just like, I need more coffee.
So let's say we have a comment here. So it says, a business partner used to say, when clients come to us explaining a software development disaster has maxed out their budget, there's never enough money to develop it right the first time, but always enough money to do it over again. That is a astute observation there, my friend.
That is an astute observation.
Super accurate. I do some consulting work sometimes where people come to me and they say, hey, we need a website. I'm like, I'm not going to build it. I don't have time to do that, but I can help you figure out what you need. So I go in and do like a short consult to just help them map out their needs and then figure out how to write a call for submissions, right? And find the right client and even navigate like all the people that are applying and everything and vet them. And what I always find shocking is if they start out with the notion that they're going to use open source software, the budget is way lower than it would
Mhm.
be.
Mhm.
Like orders of magnitude lower.
Yeah.
And I think the most
Outrageous.
extreme was there was a company that had a website on Yellow Pages. You know that thing? They used to deliver those giant
Books.
paper piles, and then they would sit outside your house until the raccoons ran away with them, right? Or someone built a nest inside them or something. So that company, Yellow Pages, they actually have a web service. So you can pay Yellow Pages to build a website for you, and then it gets indexed and everything, right? And then
Today
it
I
links
learned.
to, right? And they had a website with Yellow Pages, and they weren't happy with it because they had no control over it, and it was very cumbersome to update, right? So they've said, oh, we want to build something else, and someone has told her that we should use WordPress. And they came in and they said, this is how much money we've set aside for it. And I'm like, well, you're not going to get anything built for that. That's ridiculous. And it took me a while, and then I was like, wait a second, how much money do you pay Yellow Pages yearly for this? Like for your ads, right? For everything, for your ads, for your website, for all the stuff in the print book and everything. And it was something like $25,000.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, so you have a yearly web budget of $25,000. Why don't you just stop paying Yellow Pages and just start paying? And they were like, no, we can't do that. And like, we could do it 1 year, but only like we could set aside like maybe half of that, maybe 15,000 for a web project. But there was this disconnect that they could not wrap their heads around the fact that they were spending this enormous amount of money yearly on getting ads printed in this physical thing that no one ever looks at.
Right.
And getting a shitty website done, and that they could spend the same amount of money and have like imagine a company that invested $25,000 a year on their website.
Old habits. Yeah. Yeah. The old habits, right? Like, how hard are old habits to die? $25,000 a year on the website. I mean, they would be running a machine, right? That's incredible. Of course, on their website, running something like WordPress, WooCommerce, whatever, right? We're talking about the cost, but yeah, somebody throwing $25,000 a year, you said, into their WordPress website, and not just the website itself, but also, right, like the investment in digital ads, the investment in blah blah. You get it.
That would be
that's outrageous.
So, and I think that speaks to this again, like the economics of open source. Is that this is there's so many components to it that are hard to just get to fit together right.
I think that's where our third business model pops
Yes,
in.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. That's the third one, which is the productized open source service, right? So I have the commercial open source company, I have the implementer services sector, and then we have the productized service, right? So more and more you see companies coming in and saying, well, we can cobble together all different types of open source all different types of open source software and present a product to the people who right now can't get over the mental block of wait, but I pay Yellow Pages. Excellent. You can now pay Liquid Web for a e-commerce website. So what does that come with? You're not thinking about, well, how do I hire a developer to bring on all the stuff we were talking about, right? Having all that awareness of those two models. And instead, they get you at that model that exists. If I pay for something, I will get a thing. And in this case, it's that very known sort of, if I pay month to month, I get a product, and this product has web hosting, which is all powered by open source software. You have WordPress and WooCommerce installed and maintained by the company. And then you have a plugin for SEO and a plugin for, I don't know, forms, a plugin for that little sidebar that comes up on the side of your online store that's like, here are the things you have in your cart, Christy.
Mhm.
Would you like to add a lip gloss to this mascara order? You know? And it all comes together, and that is something that makes sense in our brains. It is a product. I
Yeah.
need a website. I am paying you money each month, and in return, I am getting a product. And what's sitting under the product is a ton of different open source projects cobbled together, the management of the stakeholders, all of this stuff. But the guy who was paying for Yellow Pages, the name of his business is probably like a bus service, right?
I'm not going to say who it was, but it was actually like a proper, well-renowned company, which made it even more disturbing to me.
That's
It's like, I'm not trashing Yellow Pages in any way. I just find it very odd that they would be willing to spend that much money on
Right.
something that makes no sense.
Right. Well, you know, if I saw Yellow Pages start to get into WordPress, I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. You know, I'm sure that the community would be like, oh my God, I don't know, who are these people? And it's like, no, like that makes all the sense in the world. Like that is one of the things that I've seen track the most, like ever. And so right now we're seeing that consolidation, right? You talked about it. We're seeing that giant that bought EIG, which is the company that owns Bluehost and a whole bunch of other brands. They bought Yoast. They bought all this stuff. It's like, what could be happening? What's going on? They're creating a productized service. It's obvious, right?
It's
like
very, very, very like, what is the plot here? It's on the front page in the synopsis, clearly right there. There's no conspiracy. It's like fully in the open.
Exactly. That's what they're buying. And so what does the acquisition entail? It entails getting that team, it entails getting that brand, it entails all of that stuff, right? It's like, well, we're probably going to save more money if instead of donating developers to the project, we just like buy that whole thing outright. Excellent.
Yeah.
We did the math. It's ours now, you know? And that's what it is, right? Because there's a lot of money. It's becoming apparent, and there's a lot of money to be made by creating productized services from open source software and selling it to the largest number of people, right? Because again, the enterprise levels have been doing this. This is old news, right? And that's why I differentiate between the other business model, because essentially it's B2B versus B2C, right? And that line is murky here because, you know, when you have like freelance and entrepreneurs and things like that, like we consider those businesses. So I might say it's something like selling to different segments. That's your productized service.
Yeah.
And
it's very much, it's SaaS. Is
what
it is.
Yeah.
It's like
just
SaaS built on open source. And I think
every time I hear open source SaaS, I'm like, right, yes. Like I will wrap my brain around that. Right?
But that is what it is.
It's exactly what it is. It's exactly what it is.
And I think if you go digging, as I've done, into some of the big web hosts and their website builder services, you find WordPress sitting on the bottom, right? It's interesting because I've actually seen one web host where they have like a creator interface, right? That looks like the web hosting interface and everything. And then you go deep enough into it, and you're like, oh, they just put it on top of WordPress. That is literally just an interface that feeds into the WordPress API and then runs WordPress on the back, because then they don't have to build a whole damn CMS, right?
And what's interesting
and they literally sell a WordPress package or their website builder package, and it's the same thing. It's just an interface change, and it's the exact same product.
And they don't have to open source that.
No, of course not. Well,
that's
they have to open source it, but they don't have to distribute it. And I think that's like one of the key parts of when I talk to clients, a lot of people come up with this, or this doesn't happen as much anymore, but it used to happen that clients were concerned about using open source because they thought that using open source means they have to share their code back. So they were like, if I have someone build an open source website and design, then we have to contribute the design back into the community and other people will build my website, right? And I had to explain that, you know, I could go down the road of saying anyone can go to your website and just strip out the CSS and HTML and build the same website. We're just going to not touch that at all. But no, the fact that it's under an open source license, it doesn't say anything about a requirement to distribute. It says if you distribute it, you can't impose on the person you distribute it to not continue distributing it, right? It's this perpetual like pass it forward type thing, right? It's a viral license. Once you give it away, you are giving it away,
Right.
and then you have no control over it anymore. Then it's not yours. And the software, the open source licenses are very much licenses that protect the freedom of the software. Not the freedom of the user or the freedom of the person who built it, but the software itself. That, that's where the protection is. So it's it runs counter to many things, but it powers the internet. Everything that, like, all the stuff that is making it possible for us to have this conversation right now sits on top of open source software.
Everything.
And I'm paying money to this platform to use a bunch of open source software to make this possible. And the reason I'm paying money to this platform is because if I were to sit down and try to make this work myself, I might succeed. It would take forever. Right. It would be a horrible experience. And I would spend so much time on doing that I could have spent on doing literally anything else, right?
Yep. I could build all of this out and spend years getting this up so that I can have my own podcast on my own platform, or I can just throw someone $19. And that used to be
the same time. Someone did, right? And that's the thing. Someone, like, some guys in Vancouver Island were like, we're just gonna, like, make a company that has a logo that is a duck with headphones on, and we're gonna do this online streaming thing. And then this pandemic happened, and suddenly their company went from, like, this little dinky toy to this, oh crap, everyone is using it now. This is a massive business opportunity. Because they did what you were talking about. Like, they took one of these business models. In this case, take a bunch of open source, plug it together a certain way, put some nice design on it, sell it as a service.
And that's, it used to be that we thought that was a world that was exclusive to closed source software. And now we're sort of discovering it's not. Oh, people are paying for something else. The value does not come from not having that be available. And that's exactly where that productized service is coming in. We're going to see more and more than that, because now we're going after the guy that's currently using Yellow Pages.
I think this is a good place to end it. This has been a fantastic conversation. I thank you very much for joining me. Like we alluded to, if you are interested in Christie's podcast, which you should be if you were interested in this conversation, you can find it at opensourceeconomist.com. It is a fantastic piece of work, I have to say. I haven't listened to all of it because I got derailed by something else, but I listened to the first few episodes. It is eloquently produced, extremely high quality content, and it did the thing that I think is important, which is it's not coming at the problem from I'm going to explain to you why this is great and fine and everything is all pixel dust and rainbows. It's coming at it from a critical journalistic perspective, which I really appreciate. So if you have a podcatcher, I think we still call them that, and you like to listen to podcasts and you're interested in open source and how people make money online, go check out the Open Source Economist.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Wow. I really appreciate you saying that. And I'll plug that further because I feel strongly that if you're interested in everything we discussed, every single topic we touched on is a podcast episode. Each episode, I have several episodes about each type of business model. We have an acquisitions episode. We have a couple of applications episodes. And so it's a single season put out, but I'm hoping to get a second one going the following summer. So thank you for your nice words about it.
This podcast is like, it solves so many of the conversations I've been in over the past decade, right? It's like, I wish I could go back in time and be like, stop having this conversation, go listen to this podcast, and it'll explain all of this. Stop just being ridiculous about it. There's reason behind it, or like your arguments don't actually hold any meaningful sense because as explained in episode 3.
Yeah.
So if you work in open source, this is definitely like mandatory reading, listening at this point, because it
Oh, thank you.
sheds light on things that we've all tried to figure out. Someone says that website doesn't work. It worked a second ago. You can also go to christiechirinos.com/podcast.
Yep.
If the other domain doesn't work, because I know that the second we are over here, Christie's going to be all over the DNS and figuring out how to get everything to point to the right place. Everything will be fine. But you can also go to christiechirinos.com/podcast. It's the same thing.
Yes.
Or just go to your podcaster and literally search for open source Economist.
Yeah.
I did it on 2 of the podcatcher apps I use, and they show up because of the magic of open source.
That's right.
And RSS feeds. So
that's right.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for joining me. This was an excellent conversation, and I learned a lot. And for all of you watching, I do these roughly every 2 weeks, where I try to bring someone in to explain some topic and make sense of it. So if you have a topic about the internet, the web, or anything related to that you want to make sense of, send me a note, and I will find someone to help explain it. All right. Until next time, thank you all for joining.